It was a little bit of a challenge for us because Lauderdale House does not have an in-house technician. So tonight is brought to you by DIY Technology. Nick, being a star, Alison Gwill, our amazing singer, has discovered new and unending talents of expertise on Zoom, learning as she goes. Stephen Hose, our resident pianist, has pushed the barrel out and has actually got to grips with a HN4 recording machine, which will bring the music to you in a form which we hope that you're going to want to listen to. Sadly, he's not with us live playing. The limits of Zoom technology and the internet delay meant that if we'd put him live through the Zoom recording, it would have sounded a bit like Honky Tonk Haydn. Therefore, he's recorded all his stuff. He'll be joining me to listen in. And Alison Gwill will be playing it from her studio. And I think that what we've come up with is something that's actually a pretty good result. Not quite like having Stephen in the room with you, but a very good start. This is all about bringing people together. It's really exciting to have got this far, and there's a huge amount of work gone in by all our performers and by Nick, which we're really grateful for. I'm really looking forward to it as well. I've got a personal interest in that my great-grandfather, Frederick Steer, was also at Gallipoli. He was awarded the Military Cross, and he's got quite an interesting backstory because he was originally in the Royal Navy and was a naval reservist when he was called up for the Great War, but ended up seconded to the army. So we have in the family an individual who has a gallantry medal from the Navy from before that and an army medal subsequently during the war. We're going to start with a slideshow which commemorates all the young men who died at Gallipoli who came from Highgate School. While that's on, I'll ask you to turn your video off. That will be followed by a performance by Alison Gwill of 2 songs by William Denis Browne, who I believe is closely related to our very own Nick PC and was a fabulous composer, followed by a few readings. So I'm going to hand you now over to the slideshow. Welcome and enjoy your evening.
Good evening, everyone. If I could just reiterate, please, that we need all videos off so you can see the slideshow in its entirety. that's the first slideshow of the evening, with music played by Stephen. Sadly not live, but beautiful. Thank you, Stephen. So I will now be singing two songs by Denis Browne, and the first of these is Arabia. The shades of Arabia, where the princes ride at noon, mid the verdurous vales and thickets, under the ghost of the moon. And so dark is that vaulted purple, flowers in the forest rise and toss into blows against the phantom sun. Pale in the noonday sky, sweet is the music of Arabia in my heart, when out of dreams I still in the thin clear murk of dawn descry her gliding streams. Hear her strange notes on the green banks, rimmed out with the grief and delight of the dim-silked, dark-haired musicians in the brooding silence of night. They haunt me, her lutes and her forests. No beauty on earth I see, but shadowed in the dream recalls her loveliness to me. Still eyes look coldly upon me, cold voices whisper and say, he is crazed with the spell of far Arabia. They have stolen his wits away. Thank you. That next song is called To Graziana, Dancing and Singing. Check my technical settings. constant motion, even and glorious as the sun. Gratiana steals that noble frame, soft as her breast, sweet as her voice, that gave each winding law and poise, and swifter than the wings of fame. Each step trod out a lover's thought, and the ambitious hopes he brought. Chained to her brave feet with such arts, such sweet command, and gentle all as when she ceased, we sighing saw the ground lay paved with broken hearts. So did she move, so did she sing, like the harmonious streams that bring unto their arms their music's aid, which she performed such a way as all the enamored world will say. The Graces danced and Apollo played. Thank you. It's really lovely seeing all those waving hands. Quite surreal not to hear them. And thank you again, Stephen, for such beautiful accompaniment. It's so wonderful to be able to follow, even though I'm not in the same room with you. Thank you. So our programme now continues with some extracts of Rupert Brooke's writings. Denis Browne, who was a year younger than Rupert Brooke at rugby school, is said to have pestered him for something to set to music. Brooke responded with a cheery adolescent effort in praise of cremation, of which I shall read an extract. If Browne set this to music, it has not survived. In praise of cremation. I loathe the obscene darkness of the tomb, to lie through the slow hours of stifling gloom in shameful, helpless agony, changed by the worm's unnatural cold lust to slime and dust. Rather for me, the sudden flame's embrace, which clings once, and therewith thy perfect face shall fade, the last of mortal things. So for all time I'll quench my hot desire in that clean fire. In 1913, Brooke was in America and proved an elegant and entertaining travel writer. This extract shows him visiting Ottawa in Ontario, Canada's capital city. A man desiring to praise Ottawa would begin to do so without statistics of wealth and the growth of population. And this can be said of no other city in Canada except Quebec. Not that there are not immense lumber mills and the rest in Ottawa, but the government farm and the Parliament buildings are more important. There is an atmosphere of civil servants about Ottawa, an atmosphere of safeness and honour, and massive buildings and well-shaded walks. After all, there is in the qualities of civility and service much beauty, of a kind which would adorn Canada. Parliament buildings stand finely on a headland of cliff some 160 feet above the river. There are gardens about them, and beneath, the wooded rocks go steeply down to the water. It is a position of natural boldness and significance. The buildings were put up in the middle of the last century, an unfortunate period, but they have dignity, especially of line, and when evening hides their colour, and the western sky and the river take on the lovely hues of a Canadian sunset, and the lights begin to come out in the city, they seem to have the majesty and calm of a natural crown of the river headland. The government have bought the ground along the cliff for half a mile on either side, and propose to build all their offices there. So in the end, if they build well, the riverfront at Ottawa will be a noble sight. And just to show that it is Canada and not utopia, the line of national buildings will always be broken by an expensive and superb hotel the Canadian Pacific Railway has been allowed to erect on the twin and neighbouring promontory to that of the Houses of Parliament. The streets of Ottawa are very quiet and shaded with trees. The houses are mostly of that cool, homely wooden kind, with verandas on which, or on the steps, the whole family may sit in the evening and observe the passers-by. This is possible for both the rich and the poor, who live nearer each other in Ottawa than in most cities. In general, there is an air of civilization which extends even over the country round. But in the country you see little signs, a patch of swamp, or thickets of still untouched primeval wood, which remind you that Europeans have not long had this land. I was taken in a motor car some 20 miles or more over the execrable roads around here to a lovely little lake in the hills northwest of Ottawa. We went by little French villages and fields at first, and then through rocky, tangled woods of birch and poplar, rich with milkweed and blue cornflowers, and the aromatic thimbleberry blossom, and that romantic, light, purple-red flower which is called fireweed, because it is the first vegetation to spring up in the prairie after a fire has passed over, and so might be adopted as the emblematic flower of a sense of humour. They told me casually that there was nothing but a few villages between me and the North Pole. It is probably true of several commonly frequented places in this country, but it gave a thrill to hear it. And now a sonnet, written in October 1914, when the Royal Naval Division was at camp in Blandford. It became the second of the famous war sonnets. As soon as it was complete, Brooke sent it off to Cathleen Nesbitt. Both later wrote of it as our sonnet. Safety. Dear of all happy in the hour, most blessed, he who has found our hid security, assured in the dark tides of the world at rest, and heard our word, who is so safe as we? We have found safety with all things undying, the winds and morning, tears of men and mirth, the deep night and birds singing and clouds flying, and sleep and freedom and the autumnal earth. We have built a house that is not for time's throwing. We have gained a peace unshaken by pain forever. War knows no power. Safe shall be my going. Secretly armed against all death's endeavour. Safe where all safety's lost. Safe where men fall. And if these poor limbs die, safest of all. And finally, this is a piece Rupert Brooke wrote on board Grantley Castle en route to Gallipoli. Fragment. I strayed about the deck an hour tonight, under a cloudy, moonless sky, and peeped in at the windows, watched my friends at table, or playing cards, or standing in the doorway, or coming out into the darkness. Still, no one could see me. I would have thought of them, heedless within a week of battle, in pity. Pride in their strength and in the weight and firmness and linked beauty of bodies, and pity that this gay machine of splendid soon be broken, thought little of, pashed, scattered. Only, always, I could but see them, against the lamplight, pass, like coloured shadows, thinner than filmy glass, slight bubbles, fainter than the waves' faint light, that broke to phosphorus out in the night, perishing things and strange ghosts, soon to die, to other ghosts, this one, or that, or I. And now I would like to introduce Ghislaine Pearce, who will introduce a tribute to the work of the remarkable artist Robert Gibbings, who survived a serious wound at Gallipoli and went on after the war to success as a woodcarver, author and naturalist. Ghislaine recently completed a large banner on the voyage of the soldiers, including Rupert Brooke, who left Blandford Camp for Gallipoli in 1915. She found Gibbings' artwork an inspiration. The banner is on exhibition in Blandford Church. Over to you, Ghislaine.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be able to talk to you about Robert Gibbings, because I do think that his work is really worth seeking out, and you should do that if you haven't done it already. So, Robert Gibbings was an artist who worked in many media, drawing, painting and sculpting, but he is most highly acclaimed as a towering figure, both physically and metaphorically, in the development of the art of the woodcut engraving. In my view, it is unjust that these days he is not as well known in this field as some of his contemporaries, such as Eric Gill. He was born in Ireland in 1889 and started drawing at the age of 10. When he was about 15, he announced his intention to become an artist. This was firmly vetoed by his father, who was later to become the Canon of Cork Cathedral, on the grounds that 1, he would starve, and 2, that he would have to look at naked women. Fortunately, following a not particularly successful 3 years studying medicine at University College Cork, his parents relented, and at the age of 22, he moved to London to study at Slade and the Central School of Art and Design. Here he studied book illustration under Noel Rook, who was a pioneer of modern woodcut engraving and a proponent of the idea that wood engraving should be art in their own right and not just a means of reproducing drawings. Gibbings clearly took this maxim to heart and went on to embody it in his work. In 1914, Gibbings enlisted, joining the Munster Fusiliers as an officer and travelling to Gallipoli with the 1st Battalion in 1915. On the 28th of June, he was shot through the throat. He recovered, but would do no more fighting. Much of what he saw during his active service and recuperation inspired his artwork, notably Retreat from Serbia and Dublin Under Snow. This last exemplified the innovative technique pioneered by Gibbings of the vanishing line, whereby bounding lines are omitted and are supplied by the imagination of the viewer. After the war, Gibbings established his career as a prolific and innovative artist, writer, and publisher. He was a founder member and honorary secretary of the Society of Wood Engravers and was at the heart of the modern wood engraving revival in Britain. His work spanned the spectrum from traditional landscape to cubistic design of fundamentally impressionistic conception. He produced promotional posters at the cutting edge of graphic design, pun intended, and owned and ran the Golden Cockerel Press from 1924 to 33, thereby shaping the concept of the wood engraved book. As well as illustrating the work of other writers, including The Voyage of the Beagle by Charles Darwin, he produced books of his own, becoming one of the most popular authors of the English-speaking world in the early 1940s. His gentle observational travelogues, including the bestseller Sweet Thames Run Softly, were replete with engravings and detailed natural history. He wrote of his travels in England, Ireland, France, Italy, and further afield in Polynesia, Tahiti, and Bermuda, where he drew coral reefs underwater with pencil on xylenite whilst diving. He was an early natural history presenter for the BBC and has been cited as an inspiring influence by David Attenborough. Robert Gibbings has been described as a big man with a startling lightness of touch. His work has a deceptive simplicity which belies the extreme technical and aesthetic skill of his compositions. I was particularly taken by the precision and economy evident in his landscapes, and it was this that I tried to capture in the banner that I designed for the Gallipoli Music Memorial in homage to his work. Of the art of the woodcut, he is quoted as saying, "Slowly, a love of the wood came upon me. I began to enjoy the crisp purr of the graver as it furrowed the polished surface. I began to appreciate the cleanness of the white line that it incised. Even the simplest silhouettes had an austere quality, a dignity that could not be achieved by other means. Clear, precise statement, that was what it amounted to. Near enough wouldn't do. It had to be just right." There is no question when examining the fine details of his work, the harmony of light and shade, and the depth and nuance that he achieved, that he got it just right. I would like to close with this observation from Gibbings' biographer, Martin J. Andrews. His style came from the spirit, a mixture of poetic evocation, intense observation, factual detail, and above all, a sense of enjoyment and love of life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ghislaine. We now have a slideshow of some of Gibbings' work. So again, if I could please just ask everybody to stop your video, bottom left-hand corner of your screen, so that you can see the full slides. Thank you.
She's
I'm Nick Peacey, and I'm trustee of the charities Gallipoli Music Memorial 2015 and Lauderdale House, charities that put on the Zoom event you're watching. We were delighted when Peter Hart agreed to take part in this event. I know him because we travelled together to Skyros to see Rupert Brooke's grave, but he's also an eminent historian, a very fine interviewer. He was the one who interviewed so many of the Gallipoli veterans for the Imperial War Museum. And he's also someone who's known for his somewhat combative and challenging talks. I'm sure you'll find this one is no disappointment in that field. Peter Hart's chosen for his talk title today, Rupert Brooke and the Glitterati.
I picked that title because what I want to discuss is not so much dry military history, but rather just look at the strange amalgam, the juxtaposition between this incredibly talented group of artists and the ordinary soldier, or sailor as they were. To give you the background, the Royal Naval Division was a rather strange bunch. They were basically, it was a creation of Churchill's, who was then First Lord of the Admiralty, and he decided that what are we going to do with these 20,000 extra reservists? Oh, I know, I'll form them into a division, an army-style formation of 12 battalions, and offer them up for whatever should come, you know, basically as extra troops. They weren't a division as such because they didn't have any artillery. So they were just infantry. Their tale is strange because before they'd even learnt foot drill properly, they were sent off to action by the same Winston Churchill, who for some reason thought that untrained troops would be good to send to help the defence of Antwerp in October, early October of 1914. Now, at that time, Rupert Brooke was with the Anson Battalion. His name is always linked in my mind with the Hood Battalion, but then he was in the Anson Battalion, and he was a tremendous character. I'll be honest with you, although I did enjoy that we've just seen, I've never been known, Keith and Lynn will know this, as a lover of poetry, but he was a fantastically interesting chap. He just caught the zeitgeist of the age. His poem, The Soldier, but it wasn't just that, and this is what they taught me when we were on Skyros, which I often muddle up with the Planet of the Daleks, so please don't get cross with me if I do that. What's particularly fascinating is just his wicked sense of humour, his looseness, which if you don't know what I mean by looseness, we'll just glide past that, I think. And yes, he was a general character of the most enormous, you know, just so attractive to everybody. He just catches the imagination, and he has caught my imagination now, which is why I was so keen to go and see his grave. Now, he went out with the Anson Battalion, and a lot of them thought, well, it doesn't matter whether we're good at soldiering or not, we'll be fine. But Brooke was more worried because he wasn't stupid, clearly, you know. And he said this at the time in one of his letters. These quotes are from his, they're mostly from the letters of Rupert Brooke, edited by Keynes. And he said, I felt very elderly and sombre and full of thoughts of how life was like a flash between darknesses, and that X% of those who cheered would be blown to another world within a few months. And they all seemed to me so innocent and patriotic and noble, and my eyes grew round and tear-stained. Very poetic. And when they got to Antwerp, I've got a quote that just shows how useless they were as infantry. They didn't know how to shoot their rifles. And this is ordinary seaman Mellanby, who's in the Collingwoods. And I use him because he tells the best story. And he says, it was the first time most of us had ever fired a rifle, but we got some practice that night. They were in trenches in front of the fort. About the middle of the night, someone noticed a white thing moving halfway between us and the wood. And the order was given for the Collingwoods to fire at it. We did so. There were about 1,000 of us, and we fired about 200 shots apiece. Towards dawn, the firing gradually died away, and we saw our object, an old white cow still calmly grazing away. They had knit it, because if you've ever seen Sharp, any Sharp, you know that any troops, they always shoot up. You know, fantastic. Rupert Brooke was pleased to discover that he wasn't frightened. everybody worries about being frightened. And Brooke says this: there's the excitement in the trenches with people losing their heads and fussing and snapping. It's queer to see the people who do break under the strain of danger and responsibility. It's always the rotten ones. Highly sensitive people don't, queerly enough. I was relieved to find I was incredibly brave. I don't know how I should have behaved if shrapnel was bursting on me and knocking the men round me to pieces, but for risks and nerve and fatigue, I was all right. That's cheering. Now, they achieved nothing, absolutely nothing, and they had to retreat. And the retreat is an utter disaster. But Rupert Brooke, again, I think he was better at prose than poetry, but never mind. That's me. He said, this is what he said. He was, during the retreat, he said, rivers and seas of flame leaping up hundreds of feet, crowned by black smoke that covered the entire heavens. It lit up horses wrecked by shells, dead horses, demolished railway stations, engines that had been taken up with their lines and signals, all twisted round and pulled out as a bad child spoils a toy. And there we joined the refugees with all their goods on barrows and carts, in a double line moving forwards about 100 yards an hour. White and drawn and beyond emotion. The glare was like hell. And people forget. They keep saying Rupert Brooke never saw action. He never saw action at Gallipoli. He did see action at Antwerp. The result was a disaster. A whole brigade, if you remember Leslie Phillips, the Navy lark, left hand down a bit, right hand down a bit, and the terrible difficulty of telling the difference between them. He always used to crash into the harbour. Well, a whole brigade, 4,000 men, marched into the Netherlands by mistake almost. I mean, they didn't have much choice. And in the end, they suffered 2,613 casualties, of which 60 were killed, 138 wounded, 1,479 interned, and 936 taken prisoner. All of those are essentially out of the war. Thank you, Winston Churchill. Now, at this point, Brooke goes to the Hood Battalion, and this is where the glitterati, as I call them, becomes, and that they join the Hood Battalion to be with him. Don't think it's some sort of accident. He is that attractive to people. They want to serve with him, and here are the ones that come to my mind, and I love them. And there's books about all of them. Frederick Kelly. He was an amazing chap, an Australian musician, played the piano, composed classical pieces. Also, he won a gold medal at the London Olympic Games for rowing. He was a right bastard. If you did something wrong in his battalion, he'd shout at you. And the worst thing of all for him was that, the lads had a piano in the mess, and they'd all be playing "Roll Like the Barrel," and he'd come along and play them some Chopin muse or something. They must have hated him. Anyway, but Frederick Kelly, a wonderful type, but not what you think. He was a proper soldier. Patrick Shaw Stewart, regarded as the brightest of them all. I know it. Not as good looking as Brooke. Always thwarted in love, I think, from his book that I bought about him. Poetically, I think he wrote one of the great poems, the one about Achilles. Fantastic. We often read that when we're over near Troy. Denis Browne, relative, known best now as being Nick's relative, but then a brilliant musician, composer, piano, organ, music critic. Fantastic. Bernard Freiberg, a soldier, just to show the mix, but a really tough cookie. New Zealander. Arthur Och Asquith, who was the son of the Prime Minister, and very much part of the literary scene as well, although he turned to be a brilliant soldier. And then in charge of all these men was a chap called Colonel Arnold Quilter, and he had to keep them all in order. That must have been hell. To use a quote, a lot of the men were from Tyneside, South Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, where the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve recruiting depots were. And this is Sub-Lieutenant A.P. Herbert. I've had to go to the Hawk Battalion, but this quote sums it up. And it's the interest I have between the two types of men. Herbert was a quite interested chap. He said, they were all Tynesiders, and most of them were miners. At first, I understood little of what they said, and they did not understand much of me. And there were two good fellows from some Durham Valley whom nobody understood. They might as well have been foreigners. And I love that, just the attitude. Fantastic. Now, The Royal Naval Division has some irritating habits, their business of port and starboard, going on leave and the rest of it, which did irritate the army, quite rightly so in my view. But they were assigned to go to join the Dardanelles Gallipoli campaign. And this is Sub-Lieutenant Denis Browne, Hood Battalion. He said, we're not off yet, nearly, but not till tomorrow night. And our destination, it's hardly a secret anymore, it's the Dardanelles and ultimately Constantinople. What luck we have here in the RND. Yes, what luck. And Sub-Lieutenant Brooke, now this quote is salacious beyond belief. In fact, I've edited it because when I read it in the letters of Rupert Brooke, I thought, this man's talking about penises an awful lot in this quote. Anyway, I'll read the bit I've left in. Just watch out for the 15-inch bits and the streams flowing. He says this is what was in Rupert Brooke's mind. I'm filled with confident and glorious hopes. Will Heroes Tower crumble under the 15-inch guns? Shall I loot mosaics from St. Sophia and Turkish delight and carpets? Should we be at a turning point of history? Oh God, I've never been quite so happy in my life, I think. Not quite so pervasively happy, like a stream flowing entirely to one end. I suddenly realised that the ambition of my life has been, since I was 2, to go on a military expedition against Constantinople. And when I thought I was hungry or sleepy or aching to write a poem, that was what I really blindly wanted. Now, so they sailed out. Failure of the naval attack meant that they're all going to have to, they go to Egypt and start training. And this is where the other main figure that I want to talk about, just keep checking that, is, and that is Charles Lister. Charles Lister, Eton boy, son of a Liberal peer, Lord Ribblesdale, the only socialist at Eton ever, I suspect. Not like the current bastards that are ruining our lives at the moment, that's for certain. Anyway, he was in the Foreign Office. He was in Constantinople, of all places, but he left as soon as the war declared. And he said this, and this is what applies to Rupert Brooke and to all of them. But Lister has a knack of summing things up. The date of my birth determines that I should take active service. And he goes to the Hood Battalion. Now, he's eccentric, even by their standards. And Denis Browne says, our party goes on happily. Charles Lister is a great game, even to those who don't understand him. We laughed a good deal over the divisional notes on the character of the Turks, particularly at one which said they did not like night attacks because they hated the dark and invariably slept with a nightlight, according to Lister. You see, it's just taking the piss. Now, in Egypt, Brooke gets the health problems. I'm not going to go into this in detail. You know about it. He got bitten on the lip and he got septicemia. Early on, he said this, while I shall be well, I think for our first thrust into the fray, I shall be able to give my Turk at the moment, at the utmost, a kitten's tap. A diet of arrowroot doesn't build up violence. I'm as weak as a pacifist. Anyway, so they then move to the Greek islands. And in particular, 17th of April, they arrive off Skyros, the island, the planet of the Daleks, or a Greek island, which Nick and I had, and another group of people had the most wonderful visit to. Lister sums up the attitude. Now, these Royal Naval Division officers, they may have been, some of them, louche, and what I don't care what you mean by that, they may have been, but they were brave men. And this is Charles Lister. I'm every day happier having left the staff, because he had a safe staff job, but he went to join the Hood Battalion. And the sight of one's own men lying down in line among the stones and scrub of these jolly hills warms the blood. I hope I shall be brave. I'm sure they will. You know, he's a great bloke. Anyway, Brooke dies on the French hospital ship, and at 4:45 on the 23rd, that's 105 years ago today. And in view of the ship's orders, they would sail at 5 o'clock next morning. They buried him. And this is Lieutenant Commander Frederick Kelly. And I love Frederick Kelly because of the music he wrote for Brooke. He may have appeared a bastard, but he had a sensitive soul. He says this, Charles Lister had gone with Denis Browne and a working party to dig a grave in the olive grove, which had served as a rendezvous for the divisional field day last Tuesday. It was about a mile from the shore to the grove, over very difficult stony ground, and the petty officers who bore the coffin were obliged to go very slowly. We reached the grove at 10:45, where in the light of the clouded half moon, the burial service was read by the chaplain and a firing party under the command of Sub-Lieutenant Patrick Shaw Stewart. accorded the body military honours. It was a most moving experience. And we were there, weren't we, Nick? Sorry, he's muted. We were, and when we played Kelly's music recreates the sound of the olive leaves, and it is brilliant. I know I'm a punk musician. That's punk rock band is what I am, and that's my generation, Velvet Underground punk. But if you've heard the sound, you can hear the olive leaves. Sub-Lieutenant Denis Browne passes the island again on the 2nd of June, and again, it's a wonderful piece of writing. We passed Rupert's Island at sunset. The sea and sky in the east were grey and misty, but it stood out in the west, black and immense, with a crimson glowing halo around it. Every colour had come into the sea and sky to do him honour, and it seemed that the island must be shining with this glory that we buried him there. Now, after the main landings, they go ashore. Some go to Anzac, one brigade, but I'm not going to. The 2nd Royal Naval Brigade, which is the Hoods, land ashore. And on the 2nd of May, they go into action for almost the first time, supporting the French and Lister's wounded. I just want you to notice the final remark. I have never heard anyone describe being wounded in this manner. Close your ears if you don't like this kind of thing. One of the shrapnel burst on the ground about 30 yards behind me, and a pellet ricocheted off the ground and struck me in the off buttock. I was soon bleeding like a pig and walking indifferently well. I never fell down. My return to the beach was easily accomplished for me on a stretcher. Not so easily, perhaps, for the poor orderlies who had to carry me. I do like Lister. And I had a feeling of great peace as I lay on my back and looked at the blue overhead. I should like to get back quickly, because I've seen just enough to tantalise. It's rather like lovemaking in this. It's just unbelievable. He tried to carry on, by the way, but his trousers were just soaked through with blood, and his men noticed and said, "Oi, sir, off." Now, 6th of May, so just 4 days later, there's the 2nd Battle of Krithia. They weren't in the first battle. And this is where Sub-Lieutenant Denis Browne gets his first wound. Second wound was fatal. And Denis Browne, I owe this to, I've forgotten the bloody name of the letter person. I did write it down somewhere. Anyway, can't remember. Anyway, Nick got it for me. And he said this: I was right up in the very front and had the most extraordinary luck. Nothing touched me except a bullet through the sole of my foot. Part of the sole was torn off, but I wasn't even grazed. I and a small party got the order to advance. We rushed up a little hill about 500 yards from the Turkish position. Some got left behind, but I and Patrick Shaw Stewart got there all right with a handful of men and found shelter. So he's all right so far. Advance to contact is what they call this in the army. Basically, you don't know where the enemy are. They know where you are because they can see you coming and they shoot you. And then on the 8th of May is when he's actually wounded. He said, I was walking up a little path up an incline with an engineer officer named Harrison when a sniper across the gully in which we were spotted H's uniform of a very light khaki. A lot of officers had light khaki uniforms and tried to pick him off. However, he got me instead. The bullet went in the back of the neck and out the side, clean through the fleshy part without touching anything. Did you ever hear such luck? It bled very little and I had no pain then or since. Now, he was evacuated, and it was on his way back that he saw Rupert's Island. Now, I want to talk now about the 4th of June, and here I'm going to talk, this is the main source. Accession number 8201, Mr. Joe Murray from the Hood Battalion. He's on the Imperial War Museum website. Joseph Murray, it might be Joseph. And he's a Geordie, and you might have trouble hearing him, you Londoners, but I'm actually from Stanhope in Weardale, so I can understand him. And this is what the trenches were like before they went over the top. This is what it was like for the officers. This is what it was like for Denis Browne at 2 hours before he was killed. In the firing line, it was packed. The fellow next to me was messing about with his ammunition, fiddling about, cleaning his rifle, looking in the magazine. Another fellow was sort of staring. The blinking maggots from the dead bodies in the firing line were crawling round right under our noses. The sun was boiling hot. The maggots, the flies, the stench was horrible. 1 minute to go, men. Now, men. He blew a whistle and off we go. Men were getting out by the ladders, but falling back into the trench. There was dead all over the place. Anyway, he goes forward. And he gets past the second line, Turks retreat. And he says this is the last known sighting of Denis Browne. So, Nick, I've read this to you before. I remember seeing 2 officers away on my left. Denis Browne was one, taking about 50 men going forward. all of a sudden, the right flank started retiring. The French had been unable to advance. They had an awful job, much worse than we did. I won't explain it, it's too long, but they really were stuck. Started road, the answer bar. We were forced to retire, hop back, jumped over the second trench. Then we scampered back to the first trench. And I thought, well, now if we could stop here, we could hold them here. I was out of puff, so tired. But when I got there, it was full of Turks. So instead of stopping over the trench, I leapt over the top. And he helped me over with a bayonet, right in the posterior, right in the nick. And he does escape. He manages to lie, fakes dead in front of the trenches. Denis Browne was, of course, killed, has no known grave. But I have walked in the field where he was last seen. And I tell you, it has an impact. The 4th of June is a failure. 12th of July, they stopped calling them second, third Battle of Krithia. They just start to call them by dates. That's how badly things are going. They try again, and the Royal Naval Division go forward again. And this is a quote from Lieutenant Douglas Gerald of the Hawk Battalion. The Hawk Battalion is the other battalion with the Glitterati, and A.P. Herbert, Douglas Gerald, horrible right-winger, but very amusing. And he said this, Gerald said, "It was indescribable, just hundreds of men wandering about in the captured trench system, in the burning sun, with corpses blackened and stinking lining the old Turkish firing steps, the sinister symmetry of their position being the only sign of any method at all. The only redeeming feature of that occasion was A.P. Herbert's instructions to the sentries and his platoon frontage. Remember, regard all Turks with the gravest suspicion." Just ridiculous. Anyway, I like to think of Lister. Just have a look at time. Yeah, perfectly timed. Charles Lister, for me, sums up. After Rupert Brooke dies, the sort of baton is handed for me to Lister, Charles Lister. The baton of just amazing talent, incisive intelligence, and super looseness. And Lister says this: he'd been wounded twice before, but this is the third time, on the 26th of August. He says this: "Just think, I've been wounded once more, the third time. We were in a trench observing the Turkish trenches, and suddenly they fired some shells into our trenches. I went along to see what had happened, to get my people back, good officer, you see, and then went down the trench thinking the show was over. Then got it, being struck in the pelvis, my bladder being deranged, and slight injuries to the legs and calves. I've been operated on, but I'm sketchy as to what has been done." He was quite optimistic at that time. The next letter to his dad, because that was he's died. He died on the 29th of August. The chaplain responsible for his burial, and this is a link again with literariness, and I believe he used to live in Highgate, and bloody certainly used to live in Highgate. And the high priest of this romantic vision of Gallipoli was a man called Ernest Raymond, and I think Nick will tell us after whether he was linked with Highgate. I'm pretty certain he was. And he wrote a book called Tell England in 1922, and then later a film in about 1937, one of the first talkies. Dreadful, but it's good, if you know what I mean. And Lister's body comes to him, and he's on the island of Lemnos, and the corpse is put ashore from the boat. And this is Ernest Raymond, and this is one of the beaux sabreurs that he writes about. And he says, "As burial officer, I went down to the little wooden jetty to receive them. And they were lifted, the bodies were lifted from a steam pinnace onto the jetty, each wrapped up in a grey army blanket. Each had pinned onto his chest some available scrap of paper, giving his name, religion, and regiment, and no more. The corporal in charge of my burial part said, 'One of them's an officer, sir,' and pointed to the longest figure of all. With my record book in my hand, I went to the officer's body to enter his name. I read, Lieutenant the Honourable Charles Lister. It was a bare and lonely little acre on a stony plain with a fence of barbed wire. Of course, there was no firing party or last post, only a silence among the empty hills. And there Charles Lister remains to this day, buried at East Mudros Military Cemetery on the island of Lemnos. Now, it was one of my dearest wishes to go there. I'm trying to organise a trip with Nick to go to Skyros and then Lemnos and then Imbros and drop in at Gallipoli if we're all still alive next year or the year after. I really want to visit Lister's grave. I don't know why. I'm not sentimental at all, but he just means a lot to me. He had an enormous potential, as did Brooke. These people are amazing. Patrick Shaw Stewart, who wrote Achilles in the Trench with the famous lines, and even someone who hates poetry likes the lines, was it so very hard, Achilles, so very hard to die? And also the storm-tossed stuff that comes on later in that. It's brilliant. It's a brilliant poem. He rises to be a lieutenant commander, is in charge of the hood by late 1970, temporary charge. Good soldier. He may have been poetic, louche, the rest of it. These people, Lister, him, they're good soldiers as well. Arthur Asquith, he rose to be a brigadier general. He won the DSO and 2 bars. He was wounded twice, and the second time his leg was chopped off. That's the son of a prime minister. How very different from the sort of people we have at that level now. Frederick Kelly, in many ways, another of my favourites. He was always a good soldier, bad-tempered gruff. If any of you know Ivan Heald, who was a very amusing comic writer, he was in his company. He gave him hell because he was just a bit like Leslie Phillips. Heald was, you know, Leslie Phillips, and this bad-tempered bugger. Well, Kelly was killed on the 13th of November during the Battle of the Ancre on the Somme. He'd risen to be a lieutenant commander as well. Bernard Freiberg was a great survivor. He won a VC, he would won a DSO already, doing a stunt as a diversion. He won a VC on the same day as Kelly was killed. DSO and 2 bars, became Lieutenant General and Governor General of New Zealand. All part of this little crew, the Glitterati. So, oh, spot on, 2 minutes early. So that's why these people are special to me. Now, I don't think many of you are military historians. I know Lynn and Keith are, and perhaps some of the rest of you are interested in military history. Military history isn't just about tactics, about who moves what. It's about the men, the many different abilities, the contrasts between people who serve, between the Joe Murrays, if you like, who are in there. I'd follow him anyway out of curiosity, you know. And these wonderful, wonderful officers who had so many skills, but who, in a way, who gave it all up. Most of them have got out of it. They could have got staff posts. Lister was in a staff post. Freiberg could have been in the staff long before. You know, but they didn't. They chose to put their lives on the line. Were they sensible? No idea. But I think we should all just think of what an amazing generation they were. Thank you very much.
It became fashionable later to decry all the sonnets and speak of them as false and sentimental. But I think they did represent the feelings of a great many of the young men who rushed to volunteer. They all had something in them of public spirit. They felt in one way or another that they owed something to society, some gratitude for the good things that life has given them, their talents and fine education. Rupert wrote in early April of a pleasant little rest in Egypt, that he had sent me an amber necklace, and that he had had sunstroke and a touch of dysentery. It destroys all the harmonies of the body and the soul. I have the biggest headache in the world, and of diarrhea that was part of the cosmic process. Even yet, I am but a funnel through which arrowroot is poured. There were no more letters. I was woken early one morning by Eddie Marsh telling me that Rupert was dead. I did not want you to read it in the papers. He has left a letter for you to be given to you in case of his death. Then I had a letter from Denis Browne, the brilliant young musician who had been Rupert's friend during his rugby and Cambridge days. It was after the divisional field day. He was tired out. On Tuesday the 20th, he stayed in bed. He was moved to a French hospital ship, and there he died. The end was very quiet and calm. He felt no pain whatever, they said. For the last day and a half, he was unconscious. We buried him at night the same evening, Friday, April 23rd, in an olive grove 1 mile up the valley leading from the sea. Of all gracious and lovely places, it was the loveliest I ever saw, delicious with purple flowering sage and thyme, and olive trees over his head, of which I send you a spray. Rupert has always been in the best of health and spirits. He was the centre of a little group of 6 of us. Once, when we were discussing which of us would die and where we'd like to be buried, he said he would like to be buried on a Greek island, and some of us wondered vaguely if he would be the first to be taken. I have tried to tell you all I can. I must write to Eddie and his mother. Would you like me to write again? I will see you when this is all over. Denis himself was killed a few months later. Indeed, of that little group, only Arthur Asquith and Bernard Freyberg survived.
Go on.